Hello and welcome back to Red Right Hand Forge. This is Marshall, and in this video I just wanted to touch on a part of the process that gave me a lot of headaches when I was starting out as a bladesmith, and that's fitting up my full tang knives with the scales. For me, common sense dictated, and it just seemed intuitive that I would line up my material in a stack underneath the tang, which I already had. I would pre-drill holes in the tang, and then I would stack my material, whether it's hardwood or G10 or anchor or antler or micarta or whatever. And if I drilled through the tang using that as a guide, everything would be lined up nice and even when it came time for fitment. Unfortunately, that just wasn't the case, and there's probably a lot of geometry and physics that go along with why that is the case, but in fact, I'd be very curious to know if any of you know why things don't line up even though you line them up on the drill press. That drove me nuts for a long time. Anyway, I've kind of done my own research. There are other videos out there on this, but if you want to see how my method, step by step, for how to get these pins lined up straight so you have a good, solid, tight mechanical connection, but not so tight that you have to stretch them and the pins are leaning one way because you're trying to reach the hole on the other side. I mean, you want everything to be nice and straight, obviously. You want it to fit tight, but not so tight that you have to bang it with a hammer and rip the material out of the other side. Everybody knows what they're looking for there, and this is a pretty easy way to go about it, and make sure that that's the result you end up with. So if you have any questions or comments, just leave them down below. I'll definitely get back to you on that. So here we go. Let's dive into it.
Here you can see I've got all my materials laid out and getting ready to get started. This is stabilized desert ironwood. At least supposedly it's stabilized. I really don't know if they truly stabilized it or what level of stabilization. But ironwood is such a dense material anyway. I don't even think you really need to stabilize it to get a really high quality finish on your scales. But I am taking my time to check the grain structure and look for imperfections like you see there. And just kind of ultimately that's going to dictate, which side ends up on the inside and on the tang side and which ends up on the outer side. When we get towards the end, you'll see that some of those imperfections or some new imperfections show up, and I do have to kind of work through those. It's no big deal. Wood's very forgiving in that way. Just chopping off the big chunks here. This isn't really necessary, but I like to work with, without a bunch of overhang there. I've just traced roughly the shape of the tang and where the pinholes are going to go. That doesn't have to be exact at this point. Just want to make sure we have enough room to place the tang within the boundaries of the dimensions of the wood and the liner material. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it in previous videos before, but for this liner material, a lot of people like to use G10 for their liners, and that's great. But something I've discovered is guitar pick material, which you can buy on Amazon really cheap. You can get like a 12 by 12 sheet of it or 16 by 6. I don't know what size. They come in all sorts of sizes. But what I really like about them is they come in layers. So this is red with a black layer and then another red outer layer. So you get a really cool layer effect without having to go through the trouble of stacking that and gluing it yourself. And I found it to be really durable, and it finishes very nicely too. Now moving on, you can see I'm just gluing everything up before I even start shaping or drilling. It's better to work with two pieces of scale or two scales rather than what would be four different separate pieces. So I've drilled, again, this is just kind of a rough marking of where my holes are going to be. If I were to go, a couple millimeters up or down on this when I actually drilled it through here, it wouldn't make that much difference. As long as I've left myself, again, I'm going to be well within the margins. Now once I drill this hole, of course, then I'm kind of locked in, at least with those front pins. And we're going to use that initial pinhole as the foundation for the placement of all our other pinholes. On this one I'm using I'm not exactly sure, but that looks like a 3/8 inch pin for the front and the back, and I've got two smaller holes, maybe those are 1/8 inch, that I'm going to use just to try something different and give it a different look. And as you can see now, I am using the tang because we want a precise distance fore and aft for our two primary pins. And again, it might seem simple enough just to stack another scale underneath there and drill straight through, but I've found that it's just nearly impossible to get those to line up perfectly if you do it that way. So this is how I get them straight. Now at this point we've got two primary holes drilled on one scale, which are perfectly uniform with the tang. And now I'm just drilling in the area that I know is going to be within the margins. Again, this one doesn't have to be exact. That's our front primary pin on the opposite scale. I've put the front pin, through both scales and the tang, and now I'm going to use the hole on the rear pin that was already drilled on the first scale, and I'm going to use that as my guide to go down through the tang and into the opposite scale, which will make our final hole for the primary pins. It seems a roundabout way of doing this, but if you've ever experienced the frustration of pins not lining up, you'll find it's well worth it. I've got tape on the outer faces of my material because, you know, you don't want to blow out the wood. Ironwood is really nice to work with. It's a little waxy, and it doesn't blow out easily, but it's a good idea to just cover yourself there. Here I'm just applying the same technique. I already know exactly where my front and back pins are going to be, so this is pretty straightforward. You can go from the inside out of your tangs of your scales, using the tang as your guide. And then you can run straight through those holes that you just made. And again, go from the inside to the outside of the opposite scale. And that's about it as far as my pin placement and fitting process goes. If you keep watching, you'll see how I actually do the glue up and some of the finish work for wood scales. This is very crucial. Before you do your glue up, you do want to make sure that these front shoulders are finished to your liking, because once you've got this secured and glued to the blade, you're not going to be able to access these front shoulders and finish them without scratching the surface of your blade. We don't want that. Put a little painter's tape on your blade or something to protect it while you're working. And then, before you glue up here, and notice I've got the pins in here. That way I can make sure everything's nice and level when I do the glue up on the front. You don't want lopsided shoulders. And I found that I don't really need to go up, like normally, like on this particular blade, I go up to 1500 grit sandpaper on the finish of the wood on the scales. But on the front shoulders, I don't really go that high. I think I maybe bring it up to about 800. It's not a super fine finish, but a little bit of contrast in that department doesn't really bother me. I kind of like it. It also gets a little bit rounded off as I'm sanding it. You'll see as we go forward, but I'm not as nitpicky about those shoulders as I am with the rest of the outside surface of the scales. On these inside corners and cuts, it's good to do some relief cuts before you start going at it. Otherwise, you might run a little far and dig into what's not supposed to be cut into. You don't want that. Be very cautious not to go inside of whatever your lines are, your guidelines there. And just take your time with this. Now we're getting ready for our glue up, and as you can see, I'm just wiping everything down with some acetone. Make sure you get all the residue off there. It's not a bad idea to scuff those up a little bit, the outside of your tang, just to get a good adhesion. You can see I've got some file work on this blade, and I really want to showcase that. Now if I were to glue this up and just use regular clear epoxy, you would still see the file work, but I really like to have that pop, so I'm putting this black dye into my epoxy so that you'll see the contrast between the outer surface of that file work, which is going to be sanded down so it'll be bright, and the black of the epoxy. You'll see when it's done here, it looks really nice. You want to be very thorough with your epoxy here. You don't want to have any voids or anything like that. You don't have to go crazy, you just want to make sure you have a thin layer covering the entire surface. If you just goop it on there and count on it to spread everywhere, chances are you're going to miss some spots, and you don't want that. As you can see, we've got a nice tight fit here. I give it a little tap with my screwdriver, but this one fits up really nice. Everything's secure. There's no wiggling whatsoever. I mean, you may not even need epoxy on this one, but I don't see why you wouldn't do it. Now I've got lots of holes drilled in this tang just for weight reduction. I'm being very careful to make sure I get those all completely filled up. This process gets a little messy, but I've got acetone on standby so that when I am finally clamped together, there's a bit of a cleanup step. And once I get this all sandwiched together, I don't like to waste pin material. I'm pretty cheap when it comes to that stuff. I just use my hole punches here to push them down through so that they're more centered, because I know I'm going to sand away a lot of this outside material. So I'm just getting them pushed through enough to where you know, I'm not gonna waste a ton of material, but at the same time they'll still go from outside to outside. And as you can see, I'm just filling up this little canyon between the scales to make sure that my file work, it's all epoxied in between the little cutouts. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to run a heat gun over this just to make sure there are no bubbles. I got pretty lucky on this, but I forgot to do the heat gun, and I wish I had. But again, this one just worked out well. There really weren't any bubbles that showed through, but that could definitely happen. So just to avoid that, run a heat gun over it at this point. I made a mistake here. If you notice, I've got this sitting in my vise, and here's the result. The angle that I put it in the vise, even though I had cleaned it all up with the acetone before I left and let it dry for a while, because it was at a downward angle sitting in the vise, some of that epoxy found its way out, and it came out on the shoulders here. It's an easy fix. It's just tedious. It takes some time. Grab a Q-tip and go at it with some acetone. It took me about a half hour, but as you can see, I got it all cleaned out of there. You don't want to overdo it, because you don't want to see like a void between your liners and your tang. And you can see I still got some up at the top there, but I think most of that is going to get sanded out when I start working on the spine. In the end, it looks pretty good. But yeah, be careful. I usually stand my blades up and I use clamps, and I don't put them in the vise to dry, but I didn't have pins coming out of both surfaces on either side, so I thought I would save myself the trouble and put it in the vise. That would have worked fine if I had not tilted it downward. Now you have to be very careful when you're doing this. I think I'm using 80 grit right here. If I were to push too hard on the top of the blade here, I would run my spine into the belt sander and create a dip that I would have to sand out, messing with the profile of my blade. So I'm very careful at this step. It may not look like it, but I'm being very mindful of my angles, and I'm just kind of shaping. If you have a small wheel attachment on your belt grinder, then it's really helpful to get into these inside corners on the bottom of your scales and your handle. I don't know if I show that or not, but I do have one, and it helps to get in those spots. And yeah, I think once I'm done with the belt sander, I go up to 100 grit here, or excuse me, I think this is 120 grit. I'm still just shaping. I'm just sanding down the excess material until I can see the spine all along the length of the handle, and the same on the belly. Once I get to that point, I go up to 180 grit, then I skip to 240, on and on and on, until I go all the way up to 1500. Now these are stainless steel pins, and one thing you have to be a little bit careful of with stainless pins as opposed to, say, brass, which is much softer, is when you're sanding, it can leave a little bit of a, like you can have little bumps because it resists the sand more than the wood does. Even a really hard wood like ironwood, if you look at this, if you run your finger down the outer surface of the handle, you'll feel little raised spots where the pins come through because the pins were, they're fighting you a little bit. I actually kind of like it. It gives it a little bit of a texture that I don't mind. But if you want to avoid that, just use a sanding block when you're doing the sides until you're ready to kind of round it off. And then at the very end, you can remove the sanding block and then use your hand or just, a curvature to kind of conform a little bit and make softer corners. But yeah, you do have to watch out for that if it's something that you don't like. I'm just using tung oil here just to get an idea of how my grain structure is looking. I've got some cavities, some voids. I use CA glue to get those out, and it works really well. You can sprinkle a little sawdust into them and then put super glue in there, sand it down again. I think at this point we're at about 800 grit. I do a little bit more after that, again all the way up to 1500. I don't do any polishing on this blade because I think it just looks good as is. I thought about doing a coffee etch on this one, but the last blade I did a coffee etch, and I just wanted to switch it up a little bit. Now this is the only time I really do a unidirectional sand, and this is the 1500 grit sandpaper. With the 1000 grit, I did have a couple little J hooks and some spots where you could see where I was reversing course. So I switched to the 1500 and just go one way to finish it up. And this is the end result. I think it looks great. I'm very happy. As you can see, the file work kind of is showcased there. The ironwood just really, it took to that oil beautifully. And I'm very pleased with the results. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. I guess I won't see you, but you'll see me, presumably, and you'll hear me. Anyway, thanks.